Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, Evan, for another economic and RBA update.
We're now the same height. We've been put in chairs and sort of put in our little gated communities, but no, I haven't grown or Ben hasn't shrunk. We're just sort of now there. But yes, we are here apparently for the RBA update because as we're going to go through in this presentation, it's almost like it's been sort of forgotten as something that's happening because we are in a wild time at the moment.
We are. So some of the big themes for today's show, we're going to absolutely go deep on the US story and obviously the Trump experiment. We're going to give an update in terms of what we've learned over the last period of time. It's also federal election time, so we're going to go deep into federal election territory.
What a time.
And budgets. And then hopefully that'll take us into 2:30. Of course, we'll then take the RBA governor's decision and the board's decision. We'll talk to that. And then we're going to circle back and do a bit of China and also Europe. So a little bit of a different order today in terms of how we do this update, but certainly lots to talk about. So let's jump into today's episode and talk firstly about the US.
This is going to be a debate and a half, isn't it?
It is definitely going to be a bit of fun. It's going to be a bit of fun. So let's start with obviously the annual inflation. So let me get through a little bit of data here from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the annual inflation rate in the US eased to 2.8% in February from 3% reading in January, which was below forecast of a 2.9% reading. Now, what I'm going to do now is going to do what went up and what went down. So first of all, we'll start with what came down, and that was energy costs declined by 0.2 year on year. Gasoline, that was led by gasoline, negative 3.1 versus negative 0.2 of 1%, and fuel oils, negative 5.1 versus negative 5.3. Shelter was 4.2, down from 4.4. Used cars and trucks was 0.8 versus 1%. Transportation was 6 versus 8. New vehicles was negative 3 versus negative 3, so pretty much flat. And then what prices went up? We saw natural gas prices soared 6% versus 4.9, so going in the wrong direction. Food costs went up 2.6% versus 2.5. Now, on a monthly basis, the CPI rose by 0.2 in February, down from January's 0.5 increase, which was the highest monthly inflation rate since August of 2023. Meanwhile, annual core inflation slowed to 3.1%, the lowest since April of 21, and from 3.3% to below expectations of 3.2. Evan,
the big one straight away is the energy part of that, because again, this is the Trump agenda. So make no mistake, his number one agenda is to bring gas prices, so gasoline prices particularly, down. The ability to therefore move transportation around the US, for Americans to transport themselves around the US is his absolute election promise. So what we've seen his action so far is coming that way. We'll talk about some things that are out of his control that he's now probably not that happy about, one of them being Russia not going to the ceasefire. But they were the first things to look at. Overall, though, it still shows that shelter is a massive problem. Like, it's still growing at well and truly double what the inflation rate is. If you look at the overall movement in things like new car sales, that's going to be interesting because this is pre-tariffs on Canada. Give me the right C country, right? Canada and Mexico. And those two nations actually combined are about 21% of all imported vehicles into the US.
Ooh, good to know.
So that's something to watch.
The other thing to watch here is that inflation expectations. So this is the forecast of where they see inflation going. And we saw that surging year on year with the gauge rising to 4.9%, which is the highest reading since November of 2022. And that was from a previous reading of 4.3%. So this rollout of tariffs, everyone understands what tariffs means. It means everyone pays more, and the government takes the revenue of everyone paying more. And we saw the inflation expectations for the next 5 years also surge to 3.9% from 3.5% in the February reading. And this is the largest month-over-month increase, wait for this, since 1993.
Yeah.
So the context here is real in the sense that effectively these tariffs are going to be inflationary. They are going to slow the economy down initially. This is the great debate in terms of how long can this last for, is what we're seeing in this particular data. So there is this real sense that inflation is going to be persistent. Whether that's true or not is yet to be seen. All right, let's talk about what the Fed did with the cash rate. So the Fed Reserve kept the Fed funds rate unchanged at 4.5 to 4.4% during their March meeting, extending a pause in the cutting cycle that began in January, which was in line with expectations. However, policymakers noted that the uncertainty around the economic outlook has increased, but still anticipate reducing interest rates by around 50 basis points this year, which was the same projection that they had at their December meeting. Now, off the back of that, we saw some GDP forecasts were also revised. And these policymakers know what they're talking about. So what did we see? We saw a revised lower in terms of GDP this year from 1.7 off the back of a forecast of 2.1%. So they know it's going to slow the economy down. Growth projections were also revised down in 2026 to 1.8% versus 2%, and in 2027 to 1.8% from 1.9%. So they're basically saying that this is going to take a while to flow through, and it's going to mean that the economy is going to run slower for longer, which is also quite interesting. In terms of the PCE inflation, seen to be higher in 2025, 2.7 versus 2.5%. It goes on. Unemployment rate is seen slightly higher, so moving from 4 to 4.4% from 4.3, and so that's basically saying that through this slowing economy, we're going to get higher unemployment as part of that. So the overall positioning here is tariffs put a brake on the economy.
No, that was promised, was it?
No, that wasn't part of the messaging.
That wasn't part of the messaging.
All right, so let's have a look at the dot plot, Evan, and tell us what you see here.
Yeah, so again, this is verbatim out of their statement, so I do apologize that it looks like something out of the 1970s, but the one to look at is the one on the left-hand side. That is where the overall 18 participants in the board see the cash rate at the end of each year. So 2025 is the one on the end. That is still showing that the majority of the voting members see a further half of 1% out of the cash rate. So 2 rate cuts sometime this year to take it down to a band of between 3.75 and 3.4. That's where it would be on that. And then you can see as you move out, I mean, Ben and I were making a joke offline before we came on. If you look at the long run average, I mean, it looks like a spaceship. And that's how hard it is for even the board now to forecast what is going to happen. Is the slowdown in GDP, is the ramping up in unemployment going to mean that they're going to be their forced hand to stimulate the economy because it needs to offset the impacts that are coming on with this incredible change that the administration is trying to implement? I mean, that's how I read this chart, and that's how I read the board now is so unsure about the impact of inflation, the impact on unemployment, the impact on growth, that it's basically telling us we can see 12 months. In fact, not even 12 months. We can see 9 months.
Yeah, we're going to get to that story shortly because it is
we can't see any further than that.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so let's have a look at the unemployment. US unemployment rate rose to 4.1% in February, which was up from 4% in January and slightly exceeding market expectations of staying at 4%. The number of unemployed individuals increased by 203,000 to 7.05 million, whilst the unemployment declined. Whilst employment declined by 588,000 to 163.331 million. The labour force participation rate also fell to 62.4%, and the unemployment population ratio decreased to 59.9%. Let's move through in terms of telling a story around that. And what we're seeing here now is the consumer confidence and sentiment. So this is basically the consumer saying so much change, so much information. We're a bit unsure in terms of what's happening here. So the University of Michigan's data showed that consumer sentiment for the US plunged to 57.9 in March, the lowest since November of 2022, which was 64.7 in February, and well below the forecast of a 63.1 preliminary estimate. So sentiment declined for the third straight month, with many consumers citing a high level of uncertainty around policy and other economic factors. Whilst current economic conditions were little changed, 53.5 versus 67.5, expectations for future deterioration by 54.3 versus 60 across multiple facets of the economy, including personal finances, labour markets, inflation, business conditions, and stock markets, which have taken a little bit of a bath over the last couple of months.
They have indeed. I think just before we get off this also sort of talks about, we know the tax changes are coming to personal income tax, but what the consumer is also saying is, A, they don't know when it's going to happen. B, they're also now conditioned that prices are a certain price, and they are now being told that they're going to jump by 25% or something with Liberation Day coming up in a couple of days' time, that they are not going to be able to afford the things they have. Because in the end, the tax take only happens when a good hits the US.
Correct.
And it only happens if the consumer consumes that product.
Yep.
So this is the whole question with tariffs, right? Is that, yeah, it looks good on paper in terms of the tax take, but you're assuming that no behavior changes. It doesn't stop people consuming or using products into the US at the same rate that they were, when realistically what you're doing is you're increasing price to try and make US products more competitive internally versus internal. And therefore, you're going to have a revenue problem here, because if people stop consuming US imports and buy domestic products only, you're going to have a shortfall. I'm getting ahead of time.
We're going to be talking deeper. But what you can see here is there was this euphoria about the businessmen coming into the White House. And so you saw equity markets and confidence and sentiment hit. And then actually the reality of the situation is, wait a minute, all the goods that I buy, interesting how most of them come from overseas.
Yeah.
And so now those things
even by my nearest neighbors in Canada and Mexico.
Yeah. So that's going to be a problem. And we're seeing it now in retail sales.
Yeah.
So we saw in terms of the US Census Bureau, they released the retail sales in the US increased only by 0.2 of 1% a month on month in February, rebounding from a downwardly revised 1.2% fall in January, but well below forecast of a 0.6. Remember, this US consumer is massive, right? They consume a lot. They are well
60%
paid.
of GDP.
60% of global GDP.
Or of US
of
GDP.
US GDP. Sorry, I was going to say. Now, seven of the reported 13 categories saw declines, i.e. food services, drinking places, gasoline stations, clothing, motor vehicles, parts and dealers, sporting goods, hobbies, musical instruments, bookstores, miscellaneous retail stores, and electrical and appliances all saw declines. In contrast, the sales for non-store retailers ended their biggest increase, 2.4%, followed by health and personal care, food and beverage, general merchandise, and building materials. And sales for furniture stores stalled. So the US consumer is a little bit unsure.
What's also interesting there is that it's not specific to what we just spoke about, right? It's not international goods are stalling and domestic goods have done okay. They've just basically gone on a buyer strike.
Correct.
And that's the way to argue it straight out.
Okay, so how's that flowing into business confidence and business conditions? So what we saw from the Institute of Supply Management, the ISM manufacturing PMI fell to 50.3 in February from 50.9 in January, below forecasts of a 50.5. The reading pointed to a slower growth in the manufacturing sector as demand eased, production stabilized, and destaffing continued as companies experienced the first operational shock of the new administration's tariff policies. Prices growth accelerated due to tariffs, causing new order placements, backlogs, supply delivery stoppages, and manufacturing inventory impacts was the message from the chair of the ISM. New orders fell the most since March of 2022, 48.6 versus 55.1. That is a meaningful fall.
That's a big difference.
Employment, 47.6 versus 50.3, also fell into contractory territory, and production slowed sharply, 50.7 versus 52.5. In addition, price pressures accelerated to the highest since June of 2022, 62.4 versus 54.9. Meanwhile, inventories were basically stable, 49.9 versus 45.9, and backlog of orders contracted less, 46.8 versus 44.9, while supply deliveries, 54.4 versus 50.0, indicated further slowing deliveries. That's interesting. Now, put it all together, we come into what we refer to as the Trump economic experiment. We called it here earlier when we've been talking about it later, and we want to basically explain what we've learned in certain interviews and announcements that are being made by the Trump administration. So I want to explain it this way. Howard Lutnick, he's the Secretary of Commerce. Now, he's got a goal. his goal is $1 trillion of new revenue through tariffs. So that's government money in. Elon Musk working for Doge, he's got a $1 trillion in spending savings, i.e. that's, again, further money in. Now, their job is to try and balance the budget. Now, what Scott Bessent, who is the Secretary of Treasury, so he's like the Treasurer here in Australia, he is on a mission for deregulation and personal tax cuts. Okay, so what we've got here is money coming in through tariffs. We've got spending savings that's also money coming in. But if you're going to promise, and here's the big promise that they want to make income tax zero up to anyone who earns $150,000. Now, that is an enormous money out story, right? So if they want to collect new revenue somewhere else, and I want to go on this promise. Now, their idea here is simple, that everything's going to cost more in America by as much as 25% in some cases. And so if that is going to be the case, we need to give the consumer some of their money back, and through lower taxes. So they're trying this massive experiment in terms of getting the consumer still spending by basically giving them tax cuts, but bringing in savings and monetary value otherwhere. It's still not quite addressing the enormous deficit they've got, incredible deficit they've got, but the deregulation also is about trying to increase productivity and grow the economy, which they hope that over time will also then start to address the enormous deficit they've got. So number one, balance the budget. Number two, try and, sort of tread this, it's almost like tightrope walking.
Worse than that.
Consumer confidence worsening. So they're trying to do it. And this is the problem. What's going to backfire here potentially, and we're seeing it already, is consumer confidence. Now, Bessent calls this the detox period, and it is true. They are going to have to go through a period of hardship, in potentially even recession. So it's about how much metal they hold in terms of, are they going to toe the line and keep doing this for as long as they need to do it? Because it's going to take years. It's going to take a couple of years.
Yet they've
got midterms coming up in November of 2026. So it's definitely going to be challenging. Furthermore, what makes it more difficult is the world trade story. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So I think you need to also remember that the deficit is $4.7 trillion.
Yep.
So this is part of the part of parcel. Then you have the world trade story. So we are a couple of days away here in Australia from getting what the US is referring to as Liberation Day, when they outline all of this reciprocal tariff taxation system.
Mm-hmm.
No country will escape. We have heard that already. Australia is preparing up, particularly for things like beef exports, along with the pharmaceuticals that are playing out there. Then also whether or not the GST is seen as a reciprocal tax and requirements. But this dirty 15 keeps coming up, and we actually don't have enough information to really honestly tell you this is who it is, because it keeps flipping. The latest is that it's those countries with operational trade surpluses to the US. Doesn't matter how big that surplus is, as a percentage to the US, that will differ. That's what they're talking about. So Ireland is a great example. It's not exactly a country with a huge amount of trade surplus on a value figure, but in terms of percentages, it is. And it's on there. Austria, similar scenario. Small country, but it is technically having a surplus to the US. All of those are part of the 15, including South Korea, Japan are on there as well, Canada, Mexico. On that list, we technically aren't. But there has been rumors that it's the 15 nations that have the largest trade, not surplus, just trade with the US, which we do fall into. So this is why, from an Australian's perspective, it's such a very, very uncertain period. And then again, behavioral economics is what I'm going to come back to. We've already seen it with what's going on in the US itself, with the ISM numbers that have perfectly illustrated the problem about where we sit.
Yep.
That already businesses are making decisions about what they have to do to offset the cost increases. You also then have nations that go, okay, we can't operate in the US. We can't keep selling to the US like we are, because our goods are 25% more expensive, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to look to other nations. And we saw that in 2017 and 20. We saw that in Australia when we had the tariffs put on us by China. We went to other nations. We went to India. We actually went to the US.
Yep.
The final thing to remember is this. The other thing about what's trying to happen at the top of this slide, there has been an incredible amount of work from some of the major US investment banks. The best one I saw was from Citigroup, and they worked out that on the back of the envelope calculation, the tariffs are going to have to be between 15 and 20% to get even close to achieving what they want to achieve. That alone will mean that nations will start moving. It also means that even if you are getting a tax-free scenario up to 150K, the products you're buying basically will still appear way too expensive to you, and you probably will decrease your spending anyway. So then again, the revenue collection is this theoretical idea where in reality it won't. And history tells us this. There's been many nations that have tried this. Argentina is a great example. They have been failed states for a reason. Tariffs do not work.
Now, and the reason why they're trying to do this is they're trying to rebuild the middle class. And so they're trying to bring that manufacturing back onshore and give those jobs. But remember, the reason why they originally left the states was the competitive advantage. And the competitive advantage comes in the cheaper labor costs. And so how do you then compete and win when AI and robotics and all of those things are still coming in? Those workers' jobs may not even materialize anyway. So it really is.
They don't exist, right? So the manufacturing hubs have gone by the wayside.
Yep.
They're not 5 years old. They're not 10 years old. These are 20, 30, and 40-year-old places. Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. Their Rust Belt states have been not that for basically most people's living memory. Anyway, we need to keep moving.
We do. We've got about 8 minutes or so before we head over to the RBA announcement. So let's just recap. Trump's full economic experiment has begun. They are going hard early, and they're going to see basically where it lands. It's clear that inflation in the near term is going to increase. It's clear that it's going to have an impact on jobs in the short term. It's clear that it's going to have an impact on consumer consumption and sentiment impact in the near term. And obviously, we don't know what this tariff announcement means come Thursday morning our time in terms of the Dirty 15 and how big a thing it's going to potentially be. So fascinating time in terms of this experiment, and we'll see how it plays out. In my mind, it's a 1 in 10 chance of being able to do that. I know you're
being optimistic.
You've got a little bit more of a long shot, but that's basically where I sit. All right, let's go to Australia. Now, the Australian market, we also want to basically focus in on what's happening from the federal election and also the federal budget. So what we saw,
time to do it.
what we've got a couple of minutes to talk about. Look, the budget was a bit of a non-event. The reality is they've squeezed out another $17 billion in spending, which gives everyone a moderate tax cut. It doesn't kick in for 15 months. And then you've got the cut from the petrol excise, which is the Liberals' proposition, which kicks in pretty much sooner rather than later.
Interesting about the tax cuts that the accountancy firms, some of the big accountancy firms pointed out, is that if you notice their language, they keep saying over the next few years, you will all receive it. What they are sort of going away from is the fact that over the next 3 to 5 years, the amount of people in this country that cross over the 37-cent tax bracket, which is currently 135K.
Currently not indexed.
Will actually mean that it's offset.
Correct.
So that $536 you'll get in the second year. So not next financial year, not 2 financial years away, which is July 1 next year. It's the one after that you'll get the full through. You'll only get it probably for 1 year, most people out there, because about 41% of the population will then jump across. That $536 will get basically absorbed for the first 10 grand above it. And then as soon as you go above 145, you still pay.
Look, nice to see some of our lower income earners getting something in that.
And I'm not trying to be facetious on
that. No. But I think, I think the petrol excise will probably have a lot of popularity for especially people rolling around in SUVs.
Correct. But the catch with that is it's for 1 year.
Yeah.
And as we've seen with the current government, with the energy rebate system, once you start and you start giving the electorate money, pretty hard to stop it.
It is, but I mean, that's the whole idea. If the electorate or the economy does well, you should be able to extend it. This is my whole point. Yep. It's almost like this is what I want to see in government. I want governments, they've got one job. They've got to build the economic pie. And the better they do at running an economy, the more money we have to share around. It's as simple as that. So the idea, whereas tax cuts are baked in terms of excises, they're not so much baked in, and they can make that tough economic decision. And second year before, another year or 18 months out before an election, you think they could do that because they did pull the petrol excise last time. Mm-hmm. So Jim Chalmers did pull the Liberal excise last time. In terms of energy policy, the only thing I want to say here is really simple. we need to make energy basically the cost zero. We need to try and work out a way that we can bring energy costs down as much as possible, because that's exactly what's happening in China, and it's what the US need to do. If they're going to have net energy costs at zero, their competitive advantage becomes enormous. And energy costs are so important in terms of fixed input costs in so much of what we do.
Digital world.
I'm sick of the debate. I just want basically cheap energy, and I want it for as long as I can possibly get it for. So do whatever you need to do, because energy policy is nation building. It's the fabric of everything that we do. And foreign investment won't come into this country, and we won't build stuff here if our energy costs are more expensive, our labor costs are more. They'll just ship it across and they'll import it to us. So that to me is a big story there. I want to then talk about public service jobs. That's obviously another one in terms of spending. So what we have seen in this particular latest budget, we've seen the biggest movement from a surplus to a deficit outside of the GFC and also the pandemic. And that just says to us that neither side of politics, I mean, they're trying to buy your vote. Neither side of politics are doing a good job at running a good economy and tightening their purse strings. They just don't do it. And unfortunately, the expectation of the punter, i.e. the voter, is give me more. Give me more of that in terms of what it looks like. So I'm interested in what's going to happen in regards to reducing costs, reducing spending, regulation versus deregulation. We are over-regulated here. We've had no productivity improvement since around 2017. So for mine, that's ridiculous. Yeah.
And then so the final thing that we're also seeing, this very small differentiation otherwise. And the other one that's happened is clearly infrastructure projects going to be sort of not redefined, but reorientated. So we've already seen the opposition also talk about the suburban rail loop here in Victoria. They're going to scrap the funding for that and also the Sunshine station upgrade and redirect it towards the Victorian upgrade for the airport link and a few other bits and pieces. That's, I think, the other thing that's going to happen now is that's
the libs.
It's going to be
national
off balance sheet, as they refer to it, which is a horrible term. Funding is now the target for both sides, because if you actually have a look, the off balance sheet for the current government has gone from $42 billion to $106 billion, but that's all seen as an investment. Again, the suburban rail loop is a great example of government investment that actually is not an investment. It's a poor allocation of capital.
It's economic vandalism.
It's terrible.
And
yes,
sorry, I get really annoyed by this. I mean, at the end of the day, the big spend that's happening, the big build in Victoria has obviously generated more jobs. I've said this publicly before. There's more government paid jobs in Victoria than the private sector jobs. That's ridiculous. I mean, in terms of a capitalist society, that is ridiculous. And so what we have a problem with is all these union jobs aren't necessarily going to be able to be sustained. So this is the Labor government looking after the powerful unions and giving them future work. And I've always said, you will not need a rail loop. You'll have autonomous vehicles that will take you from point to point as part of that story. So it's a dumb project, and I definitely don't want to see the government spending money on it.
10 seconds to go. We need to get to the RBA and talk about what we're here to actually do. Because again, as we said before, the RBA has almost been forgotten about what's going on right now. We are forgetting that actually at the moment, this is happening and it's just gone on.
Okay, so what do we get?
We have had no change. If you have a look at that, effective of April 2nd, we have no change as expected. So what we'll now do is we'll go through the overall statement. Because don't forget, the other thing that happened today is the first board meeting with the new setup.
Yep.
We now have 2 new members that are officially on there. Somebody made a joke the other day that the board shouldn't be a place for retired, basically, chief economists. But in saying that, we do now have this scenario, and it will be question about what I'm going to be talking about for the next 20 minutes, which is underlying inflation is moderating. I'm glad to see. So the outlook remains certain, because I think the RBA now is going to set itself up to switch the narrative. The narrative of 2025 will be uncertainty. Bang. That's the first headline in the second paragraph. And 2, that inflation, although it's probably still a bit of an issue for them, that they have to start worrying about the outlook for the growth of the economy. And they have technically, according to them themselves, still got the handbrake on although it's not at full, it's sort of levering off a bit. Are we now seeing a statement that gears us up to not just further rate cuts, but plural? Like, is it 2? Is it 3 in 2025? And that's what we'll go through now with the statement in terms of where we see it, because I think that's where we're now at with what we just debated around the US, that it's now there. And so what we've done is we've got the comparison document to come across to have a look at the big change. And from what I can see, just reading it where it is right now, it is different, quite significantly different in terms of what it was before. And that's where we need to be looking at with regards to those numbers. I also think the one that's happening here is that businesses in some sectors continue to report weakness in demand that is difficult to pass on in cost increase. So this is the other part of it, is that at the moment, the cost increase differences, because of things like tariffs, because of things like global trade, because of things around service supply, it is stopping the ability to work. It is slowing the economy down. The US is showing it, but the RBA is now telling us in their statement that this is now their switching concern.
Fallen substantially from the peak. So we've got that recent information suggests that underlying inflation continues to ease in line with most recent forecasts published in our February monetary policy statement. Nonetheless, the board needs to be confident that this progress will continue in terms of what it looks like. So we've just got the team to put the comparison document together. So now it is.
While you're doing that, I want to read this out. Uncertainty about the outlook abroad also remains significant. This is a completely new paragraph. On the macro policy front, the recent announcements from the United States on tariffs are having an impact on confidence globally, and this would likely amplify if the scope of the tariff widens or other countries take retaliatory measures. Global politics uncertainties are pronounced. These developments are expected to have an adverse effect on global activity, particularly households, firm delay expenditures, and greater uncertainty. Inflation, however, could move in either direction. This is what I was hoping to see. That is the groundwork to say that actually we are now looking at growth. We are now very much aware, and you can see where basically Ben's cursor is on the right-hand side of that screen. That paragraph, that moderation, is now very clearly saying that they are moving towards a growth outlook. That growth is now becoming a problem because you can see below, they are still believing that inflation is sustainably returning towards target in a more reasonable time frame. The inflation story is starting to become a secondary story. It's not completely out, but it's happening. And I think that's what is so important about what's on screen, is that outlook remains uncertain. The macroeconomic issues are there. Growth now has to become their outlook. And that therefore means we're going to start to see issues around rates and where rates are at the end of the year, which means that when her press conference happens in around about an hour and a half's time, it will be absolutely telling, because she is going to get very much, or at least I know the journos are getting better at it, finally actually drilling on to the idea that what are you now concentrating on? And I would argue from this statement, the flip is on, that we are moving away from constantly looking and thinking about inflation to having to think about the outlook in the next 2 to 3 years of where the Australian growth part is going to play into it.
Yeah, and I think they're hedging their bets here in terms of what we can see here. The board's assessment of monetary policy, you can see where it's changed, remains restrictive. The continued decline in underlying inflation, but is welcome. But there are where am I finishing here? Nonetheless, risks on both sides.
Yeah.
So I think from that point of view, the board acknowledges progress has been made. Is cautious about the outlook. So they're still saying that they're cautious about the outlook and that progress has remained. So I think they're saying we're making that progress, which is good. The decline is there. So it's not making a clear case for a May cut.
No, but it's closer. I mean, if you look at that last paragraph, the board will cut out continue to rely upon data. Yeah. So over the next month and a half, we will get 30th of this month, you get the next major quarterly CPI.
Yep.
You also get the wage price index in the early part of May, and you'll get in the middle part of May the next GDP figure, which we're about to go through.
Yep.
That makes May much, much more, as that last paragraph says, rely upon the data and evolve an assessment from there. So they like rolling 3 months. Don't ever underestimate how much they love quarter data, that it will tell them, okay, End of last year, things were slowing down.
Yep.
Christmas period, we knew that. We've got that data. We've seen that the GDP figures are slowing. Unemployment still holding, but it's starting to tick up.
Yep.
Part of the reason unemployment's there and employment's interesting is something that Ben's going to go through in a minute.
Nice little segue.
Yeah.
Nice little
So let's
segue
do
into
that.
have a look at some of the data in terms of what we're looking at here. So let's return back to that decision. So we've obviously rolled through the decision from the RBA. We've got the statement that we've just had a look at. So the cash rate remains at 4.1%, which is what we were talking about. We did mention there's 2 new board members on there. We're hoping to get some insight also from the governor about who's voting in which way on the board. So that will be a new development.
It looks like July coming into
we might
effect.
get that. So similar to like a dot plot or what the Bank of England does in terms of, they might be anonymised in terms of who voted what, but we'll get a bit of a sense in terms of how each independent board member is voting.
The way the Bank of England does it is basically it's as simple as hike, hold, cut.
Yep.
And then there'll be a 0, 5, 4, or however the spread happens to be.
So let's talk about, basically where we're at in regards to the inflation story. So we did see Australia's monthly consumer price index increased to 2.4% year on year in February, easing from a 4-month high of 2.5 in January and below forecast of 2.5. So it came in below expectations. It was the lowest interest rate since last November. Let's look at what's coming down. And this is the good story here, right? Like this is where I'm sort of getting more confident about an earlier rate cut in May than sort of waiting for July, right? So food prices moderated 3.1 versus 3.3. Now, when I go through these numbers, it's really important to remember that 2 to 3% is the range that they want to see these changes in overall. But you're also then thinking about how quickly are they coming down. So food prices down from 3.3 down to 3.1, and that's off softer grocery items mainly. Then you've got housing prices. They rose softer, so only a 1.8% versus 2.1. Recent costs rose less since March of 2023, so 5.5 versus 5.8. So costs, and then new dwelling climbed in the softest pace since May of 2021, 1.6 versus 2%. Electricity prices fell. We know why, because the government's basically buying out your electricity prices. So that was negative 13.3 versus negative 11.5. Clothing 1.8 versus 2.1. Education 5.6 versus 6.5. These are the good ones. Education coming down from 6.5 down to 5.6. In terms of financial services, 5.3 down to 4.5, and transport prices also were negative, so disinflationary 0.9 versus 0.5 plus, and that's the fastest drop, driven by automotive fuels as part of that story. So some good numbers in there. Let's move on. This is the one that we wanted to talk about, which, Evan, if you want to just talk to this graph in terms of where we see it moving.
So we've deliberately highlighted that 2 to 3% band with those lines a little bit stronger. As you can see, you've now got annual trim mean, which is the one the RBA looks at, which removes the top 15 and the bottom 15% out of the CPI basket to give you a much more rounded view of where it is rather than volatile items. It is now inside that band at 2.7%. That needs to be highlighted as a massive positive because it does show, and that term sustainably back to it is happening. There was a concern, as we saw in sort of, I think it was September last year, it was actually going the wrong way. It was actually starting to tick up. Do remember also CPI is not a true full measure of inflation. It is a percentage movement of an annual or a monthly trend.
And the less volatile items are taken out.
But this is a good
transport.
story. This is a good story. One of the things that Ben sort of talked about before, though, that is a bit of a problem. We've talked about the fuel excise before. I mean, the fact that it's declining 13% is because of government intervention. If you were to take it out, it would probably mean that blue line, which is the monthly CPI indicator, would pop up above it. And the RBA is still forecasting that when you take that off, which originally was supposed to be July, they're going to have to revise their current figures because at December this year, they had it at 3.7, which was to take into effect. Now they'll probably move it out to June next year. But even so, this shows you that the chart is there, the trend is there. Do need to also caveat, there's only 65% of the total CPI basket. But like I said before, and in the statement, inflation now may be the secondary story for the rest of 2025.
Look, I think the way in which I look at this is once the quarterly data comes out on 30th of April,
Yep.
if we can see trimmed mean inside that target range,
Or even touching it.
Yeah. You've got an argument to reward the punter, right? In terms of that. Now, here's the challenge. It's that sustained word that she's talking about. That buys the board a little bit of time if there's some uncertainty there, which is what she's got a little get out of jail card on this word sustained versus what it is. But you'd like to think that remembering that there is a lot of lag in terms of how quickly this flows.
This is
into
retrospective
the economy.
data.
Correct.
Right?
So it takes a while, for these sort of things to turn around. So hopefully they're respectful of the fact that it does take a significant amount of time for a cash rate cut to flow through the economy.
Which rule of thumb is 6 months.
Yep.
So the one that we saw in February realistically doesn't start taking full effect in terms of behavior until about July.
Yep.
So if we're looking at May, we are talking about probably moving towards September, October before there's actually a proper reaction to it.
Yeah. And look, now we want to do is we want to lift our eyes up to the 30,000 foot view of the Australian economy. So when we did the last update, we hadn't had the Q4 GDP numbers. We've now got those Q4 numbers. So we want to do a bit more of a deep dive in terms of how healthy is the Australian economy and where are the challenges in the Australian economy. So let's go through the data. We did see basically that the GDP for the quarter four increase or grew by 0.6% quarter on quarter, accelerating from a 0.3 in quarter three and exceeding market consensus of a 0.5% increase. So better than expected. This marks the 13th quarter of expansion and the fastest pace since Q4 of 2022, driven by rebounds in household spending as expenditure on essentials like rent and healthcare continue to rise. So that's not necessarily great because that's the inflation bit that's coming in there as well. Private investment also picked up. That is a good sign. Finally. Supported by increased investment in new engineering, electricity infrastructure and mining. On the trade front, exports of goods and services grew robustly at 0.7%, whilst imports edged up just 0.1%, contributing 0.2 points to GDP overall. Government spending rose 0.7. Now, that is easing from a 1.4% rise in Q3. And we've also got to claim
we will come to this.
Government spending is also state and federal, not necessarily just federal spending, but it still is on the rise. But that did mark the slowest gain in a year. Meanwhile, changes in inventories added 0.1%, turning positive for the first time in 3 quarters. Household savings ratios increased to 3.8% from 3.6%. I like that in terms of households are being diligent and not getting into debt. And on an annualized basis, the GDP expanded 1.3% after a 0.8% rise in Q3 and above consensus of a 1.2% rise. Now, we're going to have a look at some charts that Evan's put together. And I really like this story from a macro point of view.
Because we need to start thinking about, okay, where does the RBA have to look at? So first and foremost, this is our real GDP to the selected advanced economies that realistically matter to us. Highlight the US, and you can see the US is over, 5th from the left in terms of where it sits. I'd probably also highlight the UK. This is a country that has been under incredible pressure over the last sort of 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it too is now starting to get out of its malaise and it's going slightly better rates than we are. Then you look at where we are comparing ourselves to. We'll get to Germany because Germany is a fascinating one. And the fact that obviously it's had negative GDP where it sits, where it's just had a massive change on that. So we are sitting at the wrong end of this chart and we are not showing signs of competitiveness. We are not showing signs of adapting. And we are also not showing signs of aspiration. That word is deliberate because a government's job, we talked about just before the RBA's release, about where government sort of priorities sit. Government's priorities between balancing aspiration and fairness. When I say fairness, that means, Ben's word is, or the sentence is, no one left behind. That's part of it. And that's fine. Governments can have that mandate. But if it comes at the point of view that there isn't actually aspiration, it's just allowing overall fairness to take over, you don't actually get growth.
If you don't grow the economic pie,
Yeah,
you can't bring everyone along on the journey.
which explains the next chart. So this is the other thing to remember, is that the quarter we've just had was the first time in 7 quarters that we've actually finally got out of what should be used in the GDP figures, which is per capita. This is basically remaining and taking out things like migration. All things being equal, we have been in a recession for 7 quarters until we finally popped out of it. So it's 8 out of the last 10 quarters. The household has gone backwards. And that's what this shows. This is basically showing that the household, despite the fairness techniques that are apparently put in by certain governments of all persuasions, that overall the economy isn't coping with where we sit. Because it brings us to the chart that I know Ben loves the most when I showed it to him.
Oh, it just goes to show you how is the economy running? It's running on debt.
Yeah. And it's running through things like the care economy, as the new government loves to refer to the term. This is an unsustainable chart scenario. This is the kind of stuff that Europe has been doing for decades and has found ourselves in trouble. I'm not advocating for one side of politics or the other. What I am saying is that this, if you can see this trend took off under the Abbott government, right? This is 2014 when it really started to be this scenario where, spending from the government side, because if you remember your year 10 economics, GDP equals consumption plus private investment plus government spending plus net exports. So exports minus imports. That's all it is. That's what this shows you, right? This is exactly what this is showing you in terms of where it sits on the spending side. And you can see that even looking through COVID, government spending, for obvious reasons, was absolutely ramped up, and that was under the Morrison government. And then we've had a scenario where we did start to see the cost of living come in, and that's what Ben's pointing to in that little green bit down. Hang on a minute, the current government couldn't be slugged with the cost of living scenario and seeing mass unemployment. That would be bad for them. So the ramp up in spending was there. So I know you want to get to the next chart coming up, which is around employment, because it perfectly illustrates that in another way.
Well, yes, so it's a couple of charts away, but let's just quickly analyze what's happened from the employment story, because one of the reasons why interest rates are holding where they are is because employment is still so strong.
Yeah.
Right. And so we'll get to that in a second. So let's have a look at the numbers that came through. The seasonally adjusted unemployment rate stood at 4.1% in February, unchanged from January's 3-month high, and that matched market expectations. The number of unemployed people dropped by 11,200 to 612,600, with those seeking full-time jobs falling 11,300 to 411,200, while those looking for part-time work jobs rose by just 100 people to a reading of 201,400. The number of folks employed unexpectedly declined by 52,800 people to 14.51 million, missing forecasts of a $30,000 gain after a downwardly revised 30,500 revision that we saw in January. Full-time employment dropped by 35,700 to 10.01 million, and part-time fell 17,000 to 4.51 million. The participation rate fell to a 9-month low of 66.8, but still at very, very high levels, from the record peak of 67.2 in January and below forecast of 67.3. The underemployment rate edged down by 0.1 to 5.9%. And here's the disappointing one. Monthly hours worked in all jobs shrank by 8 million to 1.973 million hours. And so from that point of view, that means productivity is going backwards again.
Because what I want to highlight, comparing us to the US, so the US participation rate is at 62.
Yeah.
And we're at 66 and more than like 67 to 66.8. There is an argument at the moment that, for instance, there's a positive to what's been happening in the employment market, which is that there is more women in employment now than there has ever been in history. Yep. Part of the reason they're doing that is that dual income families are required to actually deal with the living standards that we need and the living standards required, but also to deal with what Ben's just talking about before, which is that because everybody is still, inverted commas, employed, we have high rates of mortgages. It's probably elevated and kept inflation going for longer than it probably needed to. It's horrible, people losing their jobs. Not denying that at all. But this is the question that will be debated in theory over the next 20 years, is that during this period, should we have actually ripped the Band-Aid off and taken the hurt, or should we have prolonged it? And we won't know the answer to that question for another 10 years.
Well, you'll never know the answer because
True.
they're all hypotheticals. You'll never actually
fair
know.
Point.
But I think from that point of view, I mean, yeah, women are aspirational. They've got their own,
and so they should be
sports, and they like, it's brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic. But to your point, it adds more money into the economy, and that obviously then does push prices higher.
But it also explains the employment figures in the fact that what they're doing is that it actually shows the household to survive is making decisions that they didn't normally have to do. So if you look at the amount of full-time work to part-time work, that's fascinating, along with the underemployment figure. So the underemployment figure shows that actually more and more people now are actually in work. They actually are gaining a level of employment that they need.
Yep.
So those women may actually be working part-time, but it's enough to sustain it. So
Correct.
There's so much data in the employment figures that show the household is physically changed forever, which I think is a very positive thing.
Yep.
But it's also a reaction to the scenario that their living standards find themselves in.
So the trade-off is how heavy the bottoming out would have been.
Yep.
And off the back of this, and this is what we see in this particular chart here. This is a chart that just brings it all home. There's the public sector jobs versus the private sector jobs and the total jobs overall. So we've seen a complete revision or reversion, I should say, in terms of really you want public sector to be driving the investment and driving the jobs growth. We didn't see that. What we've seen is increased government spending to be able to keep those jobs afloat. So that's how they've been able to land the plane in terms of not seeing a harder economic landing. But the byproduct of that is higher interest rates for longer.
Yeah, so the runway's longer.
Yeah, that's right. The runway is going to be longer, and we haven't seen, because in theory, private sector have done their job in terms of taking the heat. Because there's not enough, they've got to find cost savings and so forth. So ultimately, they're not employing more people and they're expecting higher productivity. But they've all turned to this government-driven public sector work in the care economy and also in back office and administration and all that type of stuff. So that's where I get a little bit annoyed in terms of the waste and, the decisions that we're making about when we are talking about not leaving no one behind. My view on that is people need to have aspiration. The best form of satisfaction and purpose is to have a job, and add to the community and be a positive net contributor rather than a positive net taker. And so that's what we want to see, because if everyone just knows that they can take the foot off the accelerator and do nothing and get housing and get free healthcare and all of the other things, that's not the society we want to build. That's not aspirational. And all of those other people are working harder to grow the pie, only to get their take, more of their earnings being taken away to support the community. That's the delicate balance that we're trying to get. That's why centrist politics works, because you're trying to get that balance to look after the most needy in your society, but also say to the others, no, come on, get in there and make a contribution and, go and add value to your life and live a meaningful life.
Trump experiment, shall we call it, is trying to change up one of this. One of the things that I harp on about, and I've done it on this program many times and I will continue to do it, the tax scenario and the tax take in this country is skewed wrong.
Yeah.
So 75% of all tax take comes from personal income tax and business tax. 60% of that's actually personal income tax.
Yep.
Part of the reason why we have the highest amount of per capita, we are the highest actually in things like trust accounts, is because you're taking away aspiration. How do you get around aspiration? Yep. Behavioral economics. Every action is an equal opposite reaction. People will then find ways to get around it. And that's why you have all of these, fossicking, and that's what it is, ferrying away these monies.
You're trying to minimize your tax legally.
And it's there's nothing exactly what the word there is, legally. There is nothing wrong with doing it. But it makes the system incredibly complex. It then again creates the issue between aspiration and fairness, because it's who can access that strategy. People with higher amounts of money. Again, superannuation, this is a debate for another day, but superannuation technically is skewed against the lower socioeconomic group, because you're actually offering the higher economics group a chance to basically halve their tax rate by putting it into super. That's a story for another day.
That's
that
right, but
also
that's why
explains this chart.
That's why consumption tax, i.e. GST, is such a good tax because the people who consume more pay more tax.
And stop getting caught up with that whole idea that it will hurt the lower socioeconomic. The way you offset it is that you allow the bottom tax brackets to come up.
And that's the same sort of thing. You know, companies and businesses try to minimize tax through other means as well.
Yeah.
If you have a sales tax, i.e. on revenue rather than on profit, again, you clean all of that up in terms of you don't have all this
you
excess.
Watch a company that tells you,
what about the productivity gain you get out of that as well? Like you wouldn't have to have all of this administrative crap behind the scenes in terms of compliance, tax work, and everything like that. Anyway, enough of our rant.
Or the ability to just say, well, actually, we did make a profit this year.
Yeah. Okay, so what did we see from the recent rate cut in February? What we saw in terms of the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Index, it rose by 4% or 4 points in March, reaching 95.9 from 92.2 in February, and it's the highest level in 3 years. The increase was driven by the RBA's rate cut that we saw in February and easing cost of living pressures, supposedly. The index is now just 4% below the neutral level of 100. Obviously, that's where optimism and pessimistic outlooks look in terms of where that balance is. Survey results also showed broad-based improvements with a notable rise in confidence regarding labour market outlook. Despite the overall improvement, some concerns persisted, particularly regarding international developments. That's the Trump effect, and also the geopolitical wars that we've got going on. While not the most pressing issue, the ongoing US tariff dispute did come up in some of those conversations, and that's what we were talking about. But I time to buy dwellings moving higher, house price expectations naturally move higher, interest rates going down, people think prices are going to go higher. The one for me is still around the confidence in their employment story. Mm-hmm. Like, again, if governments do stop this spending, and they are the bulk of the employer, there's going to have to be an adjustment there. There's going to have to be a detox time where there's going to be...
So I've always argued this exact point, right? So that index shows that unemployment expectations, we're pretty confident in our unemployment scenario. And it has been you can see the average is still near enough to 130. That gets back to that point, which is that if you don't feel the pressure that you're probably going to leave your job, your actions and what you do into the economy won't change.
Yeah.
And that, again, not trying to say this as a way of, it's a good or a bad thing. It just shows that clearly you're under pressure. We know you're under pressure. You're telling us that in this data. But back of your head, I'm not fearing I'm going to lose my job. And for that reason, you're under pressure, but you're not changing.
So when Besson talks about a detox moment, it is about taking the medicine. And if we do see a government in power that does decide to reduce spending, the reality is that there will be an impact, and that will slow the economy down for a period of time. But it's like what the recession that we had to have under Keating, and the restructuring and deregulation and the removal of tariffs. Then you get this incredible period of economic prosperity that's not driven by just basically grabbing more tax take. Okay, so the reality is at some point in time, you've got to move through an economic cycle, and you've got to have a period of softness to reframe that conversation to increase the long period of
Ben's conversation
longevity.
Here is what every nation at the moment is asking, which is how much goods and services do you want to get from a government? That's what we're boiling it down to, is that the governments of all persuasions over the last 25 years have actually said that it's all from us. What probably needs to be debated more openly is that it can't be all from government.
Unsustainable.
Yeah, and that's the problem. And that's where we find ourselves.
Yeah, do you want to have some treatment now, or do you want to basically bottom out like Greece did, and they still aren't out of their quagmire in terms of what happened in that? Yeah,
and Greece is a great example of really bad things. I mean, the one to look at, which is interesting enough, going through the huge thing, is Argentina and how they've basically voted in a completely alternate government to what most of them in their living memory.
Deregulate everything, and the government's not here to help you.
Correct.
The government's going to be smaller. You're going to have to fend for yourself and bring in business and bring in investment.
That's the great
and
experiment.
We're going to lead. that is the ultimate experiment.
Argentina is the great experiment.
And they had no choice, because for 100 years they've lost their economic advantage. And so they are literally rebooting.
And defaulted 3 times.
Yeah.
As a nation.
As a nation.
3 times.
And so that's again why, we keep coming back to house prices and so forth. Economic activity is the ultimate measure of house prices. Make no other mistake about it, because you can see in Argentina, for a period there, you could buy units in the downtown for $20,000 US.
Yeah.
Like, it's just...
I even heard it got worse than that.
It did.
Yeah.
But again, this is also about politicians promising everything, right? And then they get voted in, and the next politician comes along and says, I'm going to promise you even more. And the next one comes in, I'm going to promise you even more. At the end of the day, that's unsustainable. You've got to run the economy the same way we run our household budgets. We can't just go and print money. We just can't continue to ratchet up our debt. We're insolvent. It's unsustainable, and governments need to be accountable for that. But we as consumers and society and people who vote these governments in, we've also got to set that agenda to get the balance right in terms of what that looks like. So here's what we're going to have a look at in terms of now retail sales. So retail sales in Australia grew by 0.2 month on month in February, after a 0.3 rise in the previous month, and softer than market expectations of a 0.3% gain. Food-related spending supported the upturn, particularly food retailing and also cafes, restaurants, takeaways, food outlets. So we are mentally moving on from higher interest rates. It does feel like we're opening up our wallets a little bit more in terms of wanting to spend a bit. Still not at the level yet. We're going to see 1 or 2 more rate cuts that will have a wealth effect. The prices of our properties are going up, which we're going to talk about shortly. Mm-hmm. So that will make us potentially be a little bit more confident to do some of that spending. But that's ultimately what we've got to look at. In terms of the business conditions, this is where look at the inconsistency here, right? I mean, at the end of the day, businesses want confidence in government. They want confidence in what's going to happen from a regulatory point of view, and they want to make investments for the medium to longer term. And basically, with the politics of today, there's just a lot of uncertainty around what that looks like. So we saw the Australia's NAB's Consumer Confidence Index fell sharply to -1 in February from an upwardly revised 5 reading in January, marking the first negative reading of the year as sentiment fell across industries, particularly in mining, recreation and transport. On the data points, we saw business conditions edge up from 4 versus 3, sales 8 versus 7, profitability -1 versus -2. So these are all positive signs in current conditions, but the outlook is where they're worried. In terms of conditions, we're mixed amongst industries, mining, construction, transport rising, wholesale, manufacturing and finances shrank. So they were rising markets while wholesale, manufacturing and finance shrank. In terms of forward orders, were steady at -3 amid stabilised capacity utilisation, 81.9 versus 82, and capital spending 5 versus 4. Purchase costs growth rose by 1.5% in quarterly equivalent terms, while labour cost growth slowed to 1.5%. Product prices growth eased to 0.5% from 0.8, while retail prices remained unchanged. Now, NAB's chief economist, Alan Oster, noted confidence fell below range again, indicating that businesses remain cautious about the outlook. Little shout out to Alan Oster, I should say. We've had Alan on the podcast, Property Couch.
Many times.
He's a great guy. He had a fabulous career as the chief economist of NAB. He has retired at the end of last month, which was yesterday.
Yep.
So congratulations for a fabulous career, and obviously all of those great insights that you share with us, Alan. So thank you very much.
And we now wait to see who replaces him, because it's one of the most hotly debated seats out there, along with Westpac.
Yes.
So we know Westpac got taken by Liz Ellis.
Yes.
Lucy Ellis.
Lucy, yeah.
Not Liz, not the former netball captain. His seat will be very hotly contested. So whoever gets it will be somebody of pure excellence.
Absolutely. He's a gent. He's a jet. Okay, let's just round out the story around the property market. So what we did see is definitely a change in momentum. So value prices increased to a record high as the median house price across Australia reached a new peak, increased by 0.4 on the month. And that's the consecutive growth month after a short 3-month decline that we saw prior to the rate cut. And looking around the grounds, what do we see? We saw growth return back into the Sydney market. We saw 0.5% for Melbourne. In terms of Brisbane, 0.4, Adelaide, 0.8, Perth, 0.2. Hobart was the only capital city market to decline. Darwin's come out of the blocks with a 1% rise in the month. Canberra 0.2. So overall combined capital is 0.4. Combined regions, they're still doing quite well because it's still an affordability story there. So you got 0.5 increase. So nationally 0.4 overall. So naturally you'd expect we still aren't building enough property. So supply remains constrained. We've got an undersupply story, but we still have demand from both the owner-occupier and first home buyer, as well as the investor coming into the market as well. So that just gives you a bit of a look in terms of that. So let's recap what we saw here in terms of the key takeaways. We do believe that the next rate meeting is in play. We didn't think today was in play, and obviously that wasn't hard to predict. So we'll obviously be looking at the money markets in terms of their expectations. A lot rests on the interview that's probably going on right now as we speak.
25 minutes.
With the governor of the Reserve Bank. In terms of property prices are on the move again. Remember, Melbourne and Sydney make up a big portion of the overall weighted average of the median price in Australia. So if those two markets are moving, usually you'll see the national price move higher. And of course, the next time we catch up will be post-election.
Will be.
So from that point of view, your vote is important. Make sure that it counts. It is definitely, I think, going to be a little bit closer election this time around. We may see a minority government. From a property investor's point of view, if I can wear my property investor's hat, the better outcome would more than likely be an outcome where we had a Liberal National in a minority government versus a Labor with the votes or the support of the Greens and the Teals getting into power, because ultimately we know the Greens' position on rental freezes and rental caps and basically more market interference from a property point of view. So just wanted to leave you with that particular note. All right, we promised to round out the other global updates. So we'll do a quick update on China. What we saw in China from an inflationary point of view is that China's consumer prices dropped by 0.7 year on year in February, surpassing market estimates of a 0.5 decline and reversing the 0.5 rise in the prior month. This was the first consumer deflation since January of 2024, amid fading seasonal demand following the Spring Festival in late January. We've got a series of movements here, which I won't bore you with, but you can see at the end of the day, that's a big step down. And you can see that, so that would be concerning for them. And it'll obviously mean there'll be further stimulus around the particular market. In terms of what happened with the Bank of China, we saw the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, maintained its key lending rates unchanged for the fifth consecutive month in March, in line with market expectations. So the 1 year loan prime rate, the LPR, the benchmark for most corporate and household loans, was held at 3.1%, while the 5 year LPR, a reference to property mortgages, remained at 3.6%. Both rates are at record lows following reductions in October and July last year. Now, the PBOC, I should say, recently said that it would be willing to lower the rates further, again, to ensure that the ratio of bank holdings, bank reserves, remained appropriate for a sluggish economy. So that's trying to release more money into the economy. And on the fiscal front, Beijing rolled out more stimulus measures earlier in the month to boost domestic demand and consumption to mitigate the impact of the rising tariffs imposed by US Trump administration. So let's round out what we see in retail sales.
And that's what we're seeing. So I think that needs to be pointed out is that there is some green shoots that are starting to appear. Yes, China, as Ben just showed you, has got deflation. That's DE, not DIS, disinflation, deflation. Prices are going backwards. That the consumer is starting to see that the central government and the overall situation around ability to borrow, etc., is going to improve. And so you are now seeing retail sales starting to grow. It is going to be something to watch because, again, using history as a guide, 2017 through 20, during the previous Trump administration, China did what it's always said it would do if things got tough, which is to look to itself.
Yep.
And that appears to be the actions that we're starting to see. They've been very quiet deliberately. They have announced some reciprocal tariffs against the US, again, like 2017-20. It's very targeted. Soybeans, agri products that the Chinese consume quite regularly from the US. that the US can't sell to any other nation. Soybeans is a great example.
Yeah.
And legumes in general are a great example. They are a huge consumer of that. And that really does hurt American farmers because Chinese come to people like us, for example, for similar products, and our products will appear more competitive,
attractive.
And so
if they're tariff free,
keep an eye on this. And this is interesting. And again, I also note the ambassador to Australia in the last 48 hours has said that, Australia and China should talk about getting through these tariffs together. Interesting that geopolitically that's not likely to happen, and national security is a different story. But this is an interesting sign that shows that the Chinese are doing what I expect them to do, which is to look after themselves and ride out this period by looking internally.
Okay, so let's have a look at the retail sales in China increased by 0.35% in February over the previous month. Now, we need to give context on here because that doesn't sound like a big number, but retail sales month on month in China averaged 0.7. So it's half of what the growth during 2011 to 2025. So we got this huge engine of economic growth that was happening during that particular period, reaching an all-time high of 4.98% in May of 2020. It was obviously during that COVID period where everyone went in and got their stocks before their country shut down, and a low of negative 10.77% in January of 2022, hence the COVID period. So that is obviously something to keep an eye on. So let's recap the key takeaways here. China's domestic economy is recovering, is the key. Obviously, we don't know what's really going to happen around the US and China tariffs. They are going to play out. They're going to be negotiated and continue to play out. But I will say this, don't underestimate China in terms of their energy story and their robotics cost advantage that they've currently got. Right now, they're building 23 nuclear power plants concurrently, as well as coal. They are bringing the cost of energy down, which will make a significant improvement in terms of their competitive advantage when they're competing globally. Okay, let's now have a look at Europe in terms of the Eurozone and get a quick little summary in terms of what's happening there before we close out today's update. So in the Eurozone area, the cash rate, we did see some movements here from the European Central Bank. So at their March meeting, the ECB lowered the 3-year key interest rate by 25 basis points as expected, reducing the deposit facility to 2.5%, the main refinancing rate to 2.65%, and the marginal lending rate to 2.9%. This decision reflects the updated assessment of the inflation outlook and also monetary policy transmission. The ECB acknowledged that monetary policy is becoming meaningfully less restrictive, easing borrowing costs for businesses and households. That's a signal to say, okay, this is as cheap as roughly money's going to get here, people. You need to start making those investments and getting out there. They also released further updates around their forecast. So their inflation is projected to average 2.3% for the remainder of 2025, 1.9% in 2026, and 2% in 2027, with core inflation nearing their 2% target. Off the back of the US tariffs, economic growth forecasts were revised downwards to 0.9 in 2025, 1.2% in 2026, reflecting anticipated weaker exports and investment. The ECB did say also that they remained data dependent and will adjust its policy as needed to ensure inflation stabilizes at its 2% medium-term target without committing to a specific rate path. Let's now look at how that's impacting consumer sentiment and consumer spending and confidence. Consumer confidence indicator in the euro area fell by 0.9% to a reading of negative 14.5 in March, the lowest in 3 months, but in line with preliminary estimates. In the broader European Union, consumer sentiment dropped by 1 point to negative 13.9 as consumers became notably more pessimistic about the future general economic situation in their respective countries, and to a lesser extent about their households' past and expected financial situation. Interestingly, at the same time, there was a slight improvement in consumer intentions to make major purchases in their country. So this could be one of two things. It's like, I'm going to buy locally and buy a purchase for the country, i.e. a new car made in Europe. Or the second thing is, I'm going to get in before the tariffs hit. In terms of those potential tariffs. So that could be moving some of those purchases forward before costs start to play out. So in terms of the key takeaways, all eyes are on Europe around decoupling from the US And will that, what will that mean in terms of obviously the war in Ukraine versus Russia? They're already signed up to significantly more military spending. They're obviously looking at stimulus programs to stimulate their local economy.
I don't think you can get away from, like, the biggest story out of Europe is that for the first time in 80 years, Germany is going to stimulate itself on infrastructure spending and defense.
Yep.
It's 1 trillion euros over 3 years. It's about almost half of it in the first year alone. Make no mistake, as we've said before through this entire thing, action, reaction. And it's not just at the consumer level, it's at the nation level. And Friedrich Merz, who's just been voted in new chancellor, is clearly saying straight out to Germany, we have to change. I'm going to bring the change. And the change is also going to mean, as Ben pointed out before, with consumer confidence, but also business, is that we are going to look to ourselves. So already the contracts that they look like signing are with France. Okay. That in itself is fascinating. It's also with players like Slovakia and the Czech Republic, who are huge in things like drones, rather than doing what they had been doing, which is going to the US. So again, action, reaction is the other thing that's sort of forgotten about with the Trump experiment, is that the other reaction is that you create an us for them, and the consumption of US goods on exports can also now be under pressure, because if you've got a choice between US exports and domestic export players, you're going to choose the domestic play. And that's first and foremost. Second, even with the fact that at the moment the French are completely seized up politically, they're actually already showing signs of aligning across the political spectrum to start helping with the war in Ukraine has been one of them, but also around how Europe will fit going forward, talking to friendly nations is the term they're using. And we are part of that discussion. We have been invited to be part of that group that's, looking at what happens with Ukraine and Russia. But it's more than that. You can hear that it's also on the sidelines, economic trade links and economic growth. This is why it's fascinating to me, why tariffs don't work. It's because the nation that's doing it actually ends up leaving itself in the cold.
Well, make no mistake, no other nation could even attempt this other than
what the
US.
Americans are doing.
Right, no other nation could even attempt it. But this whole idea of then say, well, okay, you believe in fair trade, I believe in fair trade, and the other 40-odd nations that also believe in fair trade, well, let's just go and trade. And let's look at ways in which we can help ourselves out.
Could you imagine, as an Australian perspective, where retaliatory tariffs from us were on Ford and Holden products, GM and Ford, and we dropped the luxury car tax that we currently have on Europe, and your ability to buy a European car went through the roof? It's those kinds of changes that can actually now be seen as a possibility, which originally probably weren't.
I think that's a great place to end on. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, that's for sure. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we'll see how the experiment plays out. It's still going to run pretty hard for the remainder of this year. We're going to learn a lot in the next couple of days in terms of just how hard the US president wants to go on these tariffs and making America great again, and just how much they want to decouple from the rest of the world is going to be a really interesting story. All right, thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Ben,
for another great lot of insights in terms of that. Just remember our disclaimer: this is not professional advice; it's not investment advice. In respect of that, thank you very much for your time, and we will see you in May.
For the 16th and 17th.
16th or 7th. We'll see you on the 17th of May with a new government. Well, hopefully by then it'll be settled.
Ben, it won't be that. It'll be the 14th of May. Apologies.
14th of May.
Got to get my timeline right.
That's all right.
And with a new government.
And with a new, hopefully there won't be a minority government that'll be organised by then.
Yes.
We're a small country. Surely we can organise that.
We'll get it together.
Thanks, everyone, and bye for now.